Hello, everyone. My name is Sahar Aziz. I am a professor of law and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar and Middle East Legal Studies Scholar at Rutgers University Law School in Newark, New Jersey. And I am also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil and human rights that disproportionately affect Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States. And it also does so through a transnational, cross-racial, and interfaith approach. And in fact, the Transnational Rights and Security lecture series that we are finalizing today is our last day. We saved the best for last with Dr. Wendell Hassan Marsh, is part of our transnational focus to understand what happens, how what happens abroad affects what happens domestically and vice versa, because we certainly believe that we're all global citizens and at a place that is as diverse, dynamic, and cosmopolitan as Rutgers University in Newark. It's very consistent with the mission of the school and the center. And so before I give the formal introduction to our esteemed guest, and again, someone I feel very fortunate to have as a colleague here at Rutgers Newark, I want to just ask everyone, if you have a smartphone or if you're on, well, you are all online, access if you're on Twitter or Facebook, follow us now. Twitter is RUCSRR, that's our tag. Instagram, Rutgers CSRR, and Facebook.com/RUCSRR. We pride ourselves in using social media as a form of education, and so we post a lot of informative articles, policy reports, academic reports, videos, and also our upcoming events. So without further ado, I am extremely honored and delighted to introduce our guest lecturer today, Dr. Wendell Hassan Marsh, who is an assistant professor of African American and African Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. He is a post-disciplinary scholar of Islam in Africa, textuality, and the theory and practice of African studies. His first research project on the Muslim polymath from colonial Senegal, Sheikh Musa Kamara, stages a reflection on the entanglements of Africa, Islam, and modernity by way of a close study of the forms of textual knowledge produced by and about Kamara over the course of the 20th century. He was awarded the Ford Dissertation Fellowship for his work. His teaching interests include Islam in Africa, African intellectual history, post-colonial and critical theory, religion and politics, Francophone literature and culture, and Black studies. He attended Morehouse College, where he finished Phi Beta Kappa in English and French. And upon graduation from college, Professor Marsh was awarded the Fulbright Fellowship to study Arabic in Egypt for 18 months. Yay, Egypt. I'm from Egypt, so sorry, I had to do a little bit of Egyptian nationalism there. Dr. Marsh has a PhD in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies and Comparative Literature from Columbia University. And again, we are so fortunate to have him as a colleague here at Rutgers Newark, and so fortunate to have him agree to speak in our lecture series. So what we're going to do, just to give you a little format, is Professor Marsh is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we are going to open up for Q&A. So be prepared with all of your questions, because we certainly want this to be an engaging conversation. So without further ado, Professor Marsh, the virtual floor is yours, and welcome and marhaba.
Ahlan. Thank you so much, Sahar, for that kind introduction. There were a few moments in there I had to kind of ask myself if you were talking about me or someone else. So thank you for that. And thank you for the invitation to speak. This is kind of really one of my first public talks as a faculty member here at Rutgers. So wish we could have done it in person, but I'll take this, especially with all the work you all have done to publicize this event. This is a great showing. I shared the title, Genealogy of African Islamic Modernity, as which really is the subtitle of my book project, what I'm currently working on. And I ended up deciding to zoom out a little bit further just to get a sense of the project as a whole. So African Islamic modernity is really a concept that I'm trying to develop to think through entanglements. Right, so typically when, historically scholars have approached Islam in Africa as if it's really not a part of the kind of authentic African modernity, if you will. More recent work, there's a new generation of scholars for whom that's not at all true, that in fact is very much, Islam is essential for a country like Senegal for understanding its modernity. And so what I'm trying to do with this concept is participate with this new wave of scholarship, but to really still emphasize that these kind of very large conceptual discourses that we use to understand the world have developed along with each other. And so that's what I am working out in my work as a kind of overall statement. I will say before starting in earnest, however, that the recent events in Senegal, there's been kind of an almost unprecedented scale of popular protests in support of an opposition candidate. And one of the reasons why it's unprecedented is kind of where it falls in the election cycle. And it really challenges long-held assumptions about Senegalese political culture, but I can't really reflect those current developments in my talk today, but it's an important development that is worth looking into. So let's see. The streets of Dakar, Senegal teemed with the Gaza solidarity protests during the onslaught of the summer of 2014. Talking heads met on the top news show to discuss the matter. Bakary Samb, a Senegalese professor of Islamic studies, and Tariq Ramadan, a once major figure of global Islam, who has since fallen from grace following accusations of sexual assault, faced off. The debate quickly descended into an exchange of verbal fire. Ramadan accused Samb of having a colonized mind. At a momentary loss for words, Samb hit back at Ramadan, saying, "It is you who are the first colonizers, you Arabs." Once tempers cooled, Samb wrote on his blog to clarify the statement that had originally solicited Ramadan's insult. He spoke neither from Paris nor from Washington, as Ramadan had suggested, but from Gango, a small village on the left bank of the middle Senegal River. This small place, connected by a long, rough dirt road, and which had only recently been put on the electrical grid when I visited that year, 2014, is a far cry from the centers of France-Afrique and American Empire. Yet for Samb, Gango symbolized an autonomous tradition of enlightened modern Islam, an Islam that was peaceful, tolerant, and learned. This was so because Gango was the longtime home of Sheikh Musa Kamara, a colonial-era Muslim scholar, While the invocation of this remote locale, an obscure figure in a discussion of pressing world affairs, may seem out of place, it fit perfectly within the discourse of the Senegalese exception. The idea that Senegal's unique expression of Sufi Islam accounts for its democratic values, capitalist ethos of hard work, and religious tolerance, in contrast to other African and Muslim societies. So what I am really talking about today is how Kamara has been kind of mobilized in kind of two contradictory ways, what I call two contradictory genealogies of African Islamic modernity. I argue that these two genealogies demonstrate how Kamara is conscripted into the course discourse of exception, but also potentially disrupts its underlying premises. In that way, Camarus teaches us about Senegal's engagement with the global and what resists it. So, as I was saying before, contemporary scholarship has tried to go beyond the racial underpinnings of the concept of Islam noir. This was originally a French colonial theory that sought to streamline the work of governance by using race as an explanation of everything. It posited that on the one hand, it was the Blackness of their colonial subjects in Senegal that made them less rational, more inclined to ecstatic devotion, and more docile than other Muslims. On the other hand, it was their subjects' Islam that gave them literacy, monotheism, and historical consciousness, all of which made them vital intermediary agents for the civilizing mission. In an attempt to get beyond these racial ideals, scholars have increasingly focused on the global themes, such as circulation, contact, and connectivity, and as well as intellectual themes such as textual production, scholarly discourses, and epistemology. These are considered counter-thematics to former racialisms, which emphasize African particularity, backwardsness, and irrationality. While scholarly work of this mode has done well to revise how academics speak about Islam in West Africa, the emergent common sense still traffics in a theoretical paradigm elaborated in colonial rule and through religious governance, that is, the Senegalese exception. Senegal is a Muslim majority country of 60 million people that occupies the westernmost territory of the African continent. It is considered exceptional for its peaceful political stability and economic vitality when compared to its African neighbors, and for its religious tolerance and vibrant cultural expression when juxtaposed to non-Black Muslim societies. Both inside and outside the country, the explanation for why Senegal is the exception to both the African and Muslim rule is the prominence of Sufi Islam there, a tradition of spiritual contemplation and experience transmitted through chains of hierarchical master-disciple relationships and institutionalized in religious orders. The most notable of these in Senegal include the Mouridiyya Sufi order, founded by Sheikh Hamdou Bamba Mbacké, and the Tijaniya Sufi order, originally founded in southern Algeria, but with several local branches. A good example of the Senegalese exception put to work as an idea and kind of an explanation for everything is a recent story on PBS NewsHour that highlighted the role of Sufi orders in making Senegal #2 in having the lowest number of COVID cases, behind only New Zealand. At this point, these numbers aren't current, but there was this news story that highlighted the role of these orders. In contrast to Senegalese Sufism, Salafism, an Islamic religious movement that emphasizes ritual purity and is often incorrectly conflated with jihad as a political ideology, is constructed as an outgrowth of a foreign and dangerous influence. Recognized as good Muslims as opposed to supposedly bad Salafi ones, Sufis and indirectly the Senegalese state have been viewed as dependable partners in the global war on terror. Put differently, exception is the name of the field of ambiguity produced in the encounter of Islam and Blackness as located in Senegal. In my book project, The Senegalese Exception, A Genealogy of African Islamic Modernity, I interrogate the premises of Islam noir and its reinstantiation as the Senegalese exception by opening up a genealogy of the African Islamic modern. In contrast to the conventional representations of Africa as traditional and Islam as being anti-modern somehow, I use this phrase, African Islamic modernity, to refer to a discourse, a historical condition, and a project that highlights the entanglements of African racial identities, Islamic forms of life, and modernity as the globally hegemonic mode of social, economic, and political being. So that's a lot. Let me break that down a little bit. right? So typically, when the discussion of modernity highlights essentially what I'm calling modes of being. So this is can be glossed as individualism, free market capitalism, and constitutional liberal democracy, right? The main point that I'm making is that in the case of Senegal, these modern forms have taken shape over a very long period of interaction. By Islamic forms of life, I mean the assemblage of practices, beliefs, and repertoires, as well as existing and possible meanings associated with the hermeneutical engagement with the Quran and the embodied model of the Prophet Muhammad. And this formulation is very much influenced by Shahab Ahmed and Talal Asad. By genealogy, I mean two things. First, it refers to differential and critical histories of the present that work to trace the relations of power and knowledge backwards from our certainties to other paths. Second, genealogy refers to a criticism by the colonial era Muslim scholar, Sheikh Musa Kamara, who challenged the naturalization of claims of power based on claims of descent and kinship. In effect, I use Kamara as a counter-theorist of the Senegalese exception. In particular, I offer a constellation of compositional and contextualist readings of his Ash'al al-Ulum wa at-Tayyib al-Khabar fi Sirat Haj Omar, or the most delicious of the sciences and the tastiest of the news in the biography of Haj Omar. This is a hagiographic text about the life, legacy, and lineage of the important Tijani Sufi personality, Haj Omar Tall. Kamara was born around 1864 in the easternmost part of what was at the time Futa Toro, an Islamic political formation. Futa Toro was established in 1776 by a movement led by Muslim scholars that had sought to limit the vulnerability of the population to enslavement in the Atlantic world. And increasingly, scholars have written about this episode. In particular, Rudolf Ware makes the argument that this was an abolitionist movement. I call this the first episode of African Islamic modernity, when the state form, the nation state form, emerges out of popular revolution. By the time of Kamara's birth in 1864, however, the autonomy of this agriculturally rich region had been compromised by the French domination of the river-based trade in cloth and gum arabic, right? These are all, gum arabic is an all-important raw material for both the global print revolution that took place in the 19th century, but also for the massive textile industry, which really had a disproportionate effect in industrialization writ large on the global scale. Furthermore, Futa Toro had been weakened because of the outbound immigration of the inhabitants to participate in the campaigns of Tall farther east. Tall was the militant leader of the Tijaniya Sufi order who transformed the political, social, and intellectual geography of the Western Sahel, right? The semi-arid zone below the Sahara Desert during the middle of the 19th century. Tall had traveled widely in the Middle East, where intellectual ferment and political projects to respond to European colonialism were the order of the day. The transformations marked by his initiatives were defined by both the expansion of the French colony and their attempts to rationalize the river-based trade, but also its interaction with the messianic hopes of forging an autonomous space of Islamic economics with the partisans of Umar Tall. This I call the second episode of Islamic modernity, where we see the kind of arguments of people like Haj Omar Tall kind of anticipating the kinds of discussions we see today around kind of Sharia compliant capitalism. This is an argument that I'm trying to develop. The period of Kamran's prolific writing corresponds to the third episode of African Islamic modernity, when the major Sufi orders established the terms of what is known as the Senegalese social contract, right, in negotiation with the colonial state. This was a durable arrangement in which the orders organized around saintly lineages would mediate the relationship between state and society, particularly in rural areas. It was in this position they could compensate for the shortcomings of the stereotypical African weak state, and but also to moderate potential religious exuberance, right? So it was a matter of managing religion. These three episodes of African Islamic modernity reflect the elements of Senegal's past that have been distilled into a narrative in the present. And here I should elaborate that I use episodes as opposed to periods or moments, because I'm really emphasizing the narrative effect of way people talk about the past and how it's made available for contemporary argument. So as in much of the Muslim world in Senegal today, Islam has replaced the nation as a horizon of consciousness. It provides the dominant mode of socialization and participation in public life. The present, or a complex conjuncture of events and processes that include the Iranian Revolution, the implementation of structural adjustment programs, and political liberalization, as well, of course, the global war on terror, emphasizes, and if that kind of calls for a certain idea that a substantive modernity in Senegal is not simply a product of being colonized, right? And at the same time, the present is calls for asserting the autonomy of Senegalese religion, right? So in the encounter that I started with, we see this argument being made, especially against racial claims of superiority by anti-Blackness as a kind of global organizing principle. So trained in a department of critical interdisciplinary area studies that brought together intellectual history, post-colonial criticism, and textual studies, I'm particularly interested in how the discourse and historical condition of African Islamic modernity relies on Arabic script texts as artifacts of a pre-colonial past, as evidence of intellectual autonomy, and as a metonym through which broader struggles in the Islamic field are articulated. Because Kamran's texts were written from the margin of both colonial space and what would become the scholarly Muslim establishment of the Sufi orders, it constitutes a resource for thinking the inheritances that characterize Senegal's present, one that is productively called African Islamic modernity. So I was under the impression I had a bit more time than 20 minutes, but I can.
Professor, you can go on for at least 10 more minutes.
Okay. What I'll do is, so what I had planned next is a bit of a deep dive, but I will spare the audience that. Basically, I go to the text of Kamran's text, where he is actually recounting the genealogy, the kind of literal family lines of Hajj Omar Tall. And he is writing, of course, in kind of 1935, this interwar period. And one of the things I'm interested in is in this disproportionately large chapter in this particular text that he appears most critical. And he essentially dismisses a claim of prophetic descent for Hajj Omar Tal. And in so doing, he actually makes an argument against the entire scaffolding, genealogical scaffolding of a certain elite, a kind of Muslim elite in West Africa from across the kind of famous Islamic political formations, Futa Toro, Futa Jalon, Sokoto. These are kind of northern Nigeria, Guinea, Mali today. And by critiquing the entire genealogical scaffolding, he's critiquing this idea of a kind of naturalized authority by birth. And this is relevant to the example I started with because he actually tackles with this common misconception that there was an Islamic conquest of West Africa. And he basically shows that the conquest was a non-event. It didn't happen, but it was a very slow, gradual process of conversion. One of the reasons why I think this is interesting is because, since at least Ahmed Baba in the 16th century Timbuktu, this is the kind of argument that critical Muslim scholars are constantly having to make against the presumption of there having been a sweeping Islamic conquest, and implied that this implication that there is that there was that we see with someone like Bakr Sam, a colonization, an Islamic colonization of some sort, right? But I'm skipping that part, and I'll just conclude and wrap up by saying that Kamara is interesting as a way of tracking the broader intellectual history of Senegal, more broadly of kind of the Sahelian West Africa, Muslim West Africa, because we see the various relations of knowledge and power through different iterations. So during the colonial period, his work was filtered through the kind of paradigm of surveillance, right? It was about to what extent, what could he provide useful information for the work of governance. Ultimately, it was decided that it wasn't. And so he kind of was dismissed and disappeared. And this mammoth work that he writes, a 1,700-page history of West Africa, kind of doesn't disappear, but goes into the archive. It's not acknowledged. He's resurrected in the 1960s, the 1970s, because he represents for nationalist historiography this ideal embodiment of pre-colonial historical consciousness, right? With which one could prove that Africa had a history too, and had historical thought. But then finally, what I think is interesting about more recent developments is where surveillance and nationalist historiography provided the frame. What we see emerging is a kind of secular religious framework. And by secular religion, I'm talking about the broader moral and epistemological conditions in which we think religion, right? So the transformations, even the concept of religion, have undergone, throughout modernity. So I think, so I began this discussion with a racial encounter of two Muslim public intellectuals in which crypto-racial insults stood in for political debate. Following this conversation, Sheikh Musa Kamara was invoked as a historical and intellectual reference that embodied a modern African Islam that was tolerant, learned, and autonomous. In effect, a secular Islam. In order to understand this deployment of Kamra as a key reference, I described a genealogy of conscription in which Kamra's intellectual production has been appropriated by colonial surveillance, national historiography, and most recently for the making of a good Islam compatible with secularity. I also explored I simply gestured toward the genealogy of disruption, a counter history that resists the way many people might want to kind of appropriate the use of Kamra for various ends. There is a certain irony that I have been grasping for in this talk. On the one hand, Dr. Issam invokes Kamra to assert an anti-racist argument in the present, but in order to do so, he has to concede an ambiguity relating to the legacy of Islam's history in Africa when he suggests that there was an Arab colonization. This is a fairly common misconception that is as common in the Muslim world as it is outside of it. This fits a vision of humanity where the terms Africa, Islam, and modernity represent cultural essences that are distinct from one another. However, reading Kamra, we learn of a different position, one that has been asserted time and again by more critical Muslim scholars from West Africa. The fact that a country like Senegal today boasts a Muslim majority is not the result of an event of conquest that serves as proof of a cosmic anti-Blackness, but rather a slow process of conversion. What this highlights then is the fact of entanglement, a condition of the global present in which African racial identities, Islam, and modernity are wrapped up in each other. Taking Kamra as a counter-theorist of African Islamic modernity then allows us to appreciate the non-Western histories and intellectual traditions that challenge the common sense of global hegemony.
Thank you very much, Professor Marsh. That was excellent and very intense. Lots of knowledge there. So I will start with. Well, thank you very much, Professor Marsh, and thank you for everyone who attended this informative talk. We never have enough time, and I wish we had more time. And we will start doing things in person, hopefully next fall, inshallah. So I encourage everyone who was able to attend online to keep up with the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Again, the Twitter handle is RUCSRR, Instagram, Rutgers CSRR, and then Facebook.com/RUCSRR. And in addition to thanking Professor Wendell Hassan Marsh, again, we're delighted and honored to have you both today in our Transnational Rights and Security Lecture Series, and you are the grand finale. So thank you very much. We're also really excited that you're here at Rutgers Newark, and again, inshallah, next fall, we'll be able to see each other in person. But before I close, I just want to encourage everyone, we do have one final event that is a book talk. It will involve Mark Lamont Hill, a communications professor at Temple University, and Mitchell Plitnick. And they have a new book that just came out called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. We put the registration link in the chat, and it will be on April 19th at 12 noon. And that will be our final event for this academic year. So we hope to see many of you there. And so in conclusion, again, thank you, Professor Marsh, for enlightening us. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. And we hope to see many of you on April 19th. Ma salam.
Thank you.